Hey everyone, welcome to the KE Report, a special Sunday, Super Bowl Sunday daily editorial as we are chatting with Marc Chandler. And we are going to be talking tariffs and how it all relates to really global relations with the US. There's a lot to dissect within this topic, but quite frankly, tariffs right now are what's driving the market, and it's on almost every country's mind how they're going to respond to tariffs, what those retaliatory efforts look like, and how markets react to all of this. It's a big picture topic, but there's a lot of different areas for us to go down. Marc Chandler is the managing partner at Bannockburn Global ForEx, also editor of the Mark II Market website. I'll post a link to Marc's website in the show notes. Marc, tariffs. Look, Trump came into office and he is following through with what he promised, really going after China, Canada, and Mexico, the largest trading partners with the US. And let's face it, the US is a consumer nation. So that means stuff coming into the US you would think would get more expensive because, well, the US is taking a little skim off of it, but we're also hearing about other countries and their potential retaliatory tariffs. Also, potentially central banks cutting their rates to make up for what these tariffs could do in terms of hurting more of the home industries that these countries have tariffs on. So, Marc, how are you viewing these tariffs right now? Some are in place, some have been pushed back, but overall, they're on everyone's mind.
Yeah, and I think that tariffs are the big wild card. And I say wild because we don't know when the social media statements are made. The market is sort of lost a little bit of a sense of balance. And here ahead of the weekend, I think it really illustrates that, we had the second decline in a row of the U.S. unemployment rate. Generally, the jobs report was maybe a bit better than expected. And we had that big jump in the University of Michigan's 1 year inflation outlook from their survey up to 4.3%. And the dollar didn't really move much. But as soon as President Trump's social media comments hit the wires about reciprocal tariffs as early as today, before the weekend, that drove the dollar sharply higher. And what reciprocal tariffs get to is this idea of the playing field. Before the last round of tariffs, the U.S. average tariff was around 2 to 2.5%. So if another country is charging have a 5% tariff, that seems on the face of it to be unfair. And so the idea would be that these reciprocal tariffs are we match what the other person is doing to the US or what the other country is doing to the US. The dollar made session highs, say against the euro, against the dollar index made new highs as well on the back of those comments. And I think that remains still the wild card. Now, a couple of things that we do know. One is that the tariff threat on Mexico and Canada has been delayed for a month. So that brings us into early March. The tariff on China remains in place. That's a 10% tariff, and probably more are going to be forthcoming. And I think that countries are seeing the way the U.S. is treating its two closest trading partners that it has a free trade agreement with, Canada and Mexico. And I think that prompts high levels of concern from policymakers around the world, except perhaps in Beijing. I think that China was able to absorb that 10% tariff increase without much of a problem. They kept the dollar, their fixing that they put for the dollar, basically pretty steady, meaning that they're not going to devalue the dollar. Devalue the RMB. There's other policy levers they can pull, including tariffs of their own, export restrictions on critical minerals. They can investigate U.S. companies like Google or Amazon. And so I think that countries are going to have to look at in their inventory of where they have leverage. And some countries, of course, will have more leverage than others. And I think you're right that these tariffs are like the big wild card in the sense of uncertainty surrounding them that has market impact still. We might reach the point where it has diminishing returns. But as of February 7th, it doesn't look like we've reached that point quite yet.
Yeah, Mark, it's a wild environment where for a while economic data didn't really matter if it was good or bad. It was really what is the Fed going to do? And everything was determined on Fed policy. Now everything that the Fed or central banks are doing is almost a yawn to the markets, and they're obsessed with what the tariffs are going to mean and how other nations will respond and what the retaliatory tariffs may be. We saw a little of that from China, where they did snap back with export bans on some of the critical minerals that you mentioned, and also tariffs on specific items. Just from a broader sense, tariffs have been used for a long time, typically on specific products or industries. These blanket tariffs, though, of 25% for the U.S.'s biggest trading partners and neighbors, as you say, Mexico and Canada, coming out of the gate with those, I think shocked the world as like, wow, if they would do that to their neighbors, what would they do to us? And it's not strategic on a specific industry. It's some of these are blanket tariffs. Do you think that's a change in the trade wars here, seeing these kind of big moves, or is this all just bluster that will get negotiated in some kind of a deal?
I suspect that Canada and Mexico are more unique, I'd say, than the EU or China in this regard. I think that, we've got the person who's become the head of the National Economic Advisory to the president, Hassett, has basically argued that the tariff threat on Canada and Mexico were not because of trade, despite what Trump says. Hassett, says that they're not about trade war, but the drug war. And I find that to be incredible. That is, it stretches my imagination because Canada is hardly responsible for the fentanyl coming into the US. If anything, some reports have suggested more fentanyl goes from the US to Canada than the other way around. But I think that this illustrates the challenge that market participants and businesses have in this environment. You have the president saying one thing, and then you have some other people like Hassett or the new Treasury Secretary saying something different. For example, Trump has been critical of the Fed policy. He has threatened to fire Powell, though he's backed off from that. And yet the Treasury Secretary says Trump's not really concerned about the short-term interest rates. He's really focused on the long-term interest rate. So it's sort of like that country music song, "Don't Believe Your Lying Eyes." And so I think the market is really wrestling with who's got the power and how much power is there in the cabinet officials and how much of it remains in the Oval Office, with leaving the cabinet officials then to respin or to explain away the inconsistencies and problems of the statements from the president.
And let me tell you, Mark, I live in Vancouver, and there is unfortunately a lot of fentanyl problems that we have had for quite a while. So wherever it's coming from, I'm sure some of it does trickle down in the US, but boy, oh boy, unfortunately, a lot is also staying in Vancouver specifically. This whole talk about tariffs, one thing also living in Canada that I've experienced my whole life is how goods from the US are more expensive in Canada because we charge actually very high duties on products coming in from the US and other countries. So, Mark, what's the difference here between tariffs and duties when it seems like both just simply bring up the cost for consumers?
Yeah, I don't really think there's much of a difference between tariffs and duties. Both of them seem to be the tax on imports. I believe that the US, Canada, and Mexico have a free trade agreement that limits the tariffs. There could be other fees that I'm not familiar with, but at least on the tariffs themselves, I think that the USMCA agreement limits it. I mean, I think that for domestic content, I believe it should be free trade, that is, no tariffs. But I think you're right. I think this is part of the key issue that people have. And this is, I think, why the University of Michigan the survey showed a big jump in the 1 year inflation expectations. People think that as the tariffs go up, as a tax on imports, our consumer good prices will also rise. And you can see this through a number of different channels of this expectation. You just think about like if the average US tariff is 2 to 2.5%, and it goes up to say 20% or 25%, what does that mean for consumers? Well, I think that people think that some of that will be passed on to the final price of consumer goods. Some of it may be squeezed, maybe squeezing profit margins. Some of it may be blunted a little bit by currency moves. But I think that if you're talking about a 25% tariff and the euro, say, is trading at 103, it's hard to imagine a 25% depreciation of the euro. Or even like look about the Canadian dollar, we're trading there 143, a 25% tariff. It's all gets passed through the exchange rate. I think we're talking about levels that we haven't seen before and huge levels that the currency market is going to bear the burden of adjustment. So instead, I'd suggest that in the system, there's probably several different shock absorbers. No single shock absorber has to bear the whole burden themselves. So profit margins might shrink a little bit. Consumer prices may rise a little bit. The dollar may strengthen a little bit, like we're seeing here ahead of the weekend on this reciprocal tariff threat. So I think that we should expect some rise in consumer goods, and it really depends on then the next question really becomes, what does that do to demand? Will higher prices curb demand? And of course, a lot of it, economists will tell us, has to do with the elasticity of demand. So how much is a little bit of the price of fresh, say what's happening in the US now, the price of eggs have jumped. It might diminish people buying eggs, but at the same time, those who buy eggs might just buy fewer eggs. And so we're concerned then that consumer is really this key to the US economy, and this becomes a tax on consumption. Some part of it turns into a tax on consumption, which probably weakens the US economy.
Well, Mark, I'm glad you went through that because a lot of people are making the case that, and some of these consumer studies that are coming out in reports that people are expecting higher inflation. There's the other counter argument that, hey, tariffs aren't inflationary, but they clearly always have been. And there's only so much the currency can absorb as a shock absorber, or that substitution can absorb, or that companies are willing to take a hit on their profit margins. There's eventually some of this that trickles into higher consumer prices, as you just outlined. If that's the case and we see inflation start ticking up or consumers start spending less, what does that mean for how the central bank may respond? There's the currency response, but there's also, if we start seeing a big tick up in inflation, what does that mean for all of the dreams on Wall Street about cuts coming later this year?
Yeah, we've seen several Fed officials who have commented about the tariffs. And I think that in the past week or so, they've been more specific. And here's the challenge, I think. First, that after COVID, people were critical of the Federal Reserve, but other central banks in general, for not responding to the supply shock. They typically are more responsive to the demand shock than supply. And central bank officials argue that there's not much they can do about supply shocks. But post-COVID and the criticism of the Fed, we've seen other Fed officials who have played up that they need to take the supply disruption seriously. What the market has done is it was leaning, say 80% chance or so of a rate cut, the next rate cut in June. The market has downgraded that to about a 60% chance, but they do not even have the hike priced in for July anymore. Now, the first cut is now priced in for September. For July, there's about an 85% chance of a cut. That's down from 100%. And so the market has just pushed out the first Fed cut, the next Fed cut, partly because of the relative strength of the US economy, but partly because of the tariffs and what it could mean for Fed policy and inflation going forward.
Mark, this just seems like the world is further becoming fractured. And I think we can argue that this all started when Trump entered office the first time and started attacking all these other countries, trying to bring everything back onshore in the US, which seems like a good idea. And I'm sure everybody would like more production, more goods produced onshore. But fact of the matter is, look, the world was going more global, more globalization, which did bring down costs and it helped corporations, but it did also pass along lower costs to consumers. And again, the US is a consumer nation. If the country experiences higher costs, who knows what that could do to the underlying economy and its citizens? What do you think about this whole trend of de-globalization, trying to onshore everything, even if, quite frankly, it just doesn't seem possible?
Yeah, so I think you're right that this globalization or de-globalization, that talk began well before the pandemic. I think the pandemic added fuel to sort of added extra oomph to the direction that many people were already moving toward. I think that part of the problem is that economists have known that free trade and globalization creates winners and losers. But they were under the assumption that the winners would compensate the losers. And I think what we've seen is a breakdown of that, not just in the United States. We've seen the disparity of wealth and income grow in most high income countries. And I think that has undermined the sort of the consensus, if you will, towards free trade. Then on top of that, with the pandemic, I think it drove home the point that the extended supply chains that were really characterized, say, almost 40 years, beginning in the early 80s through the late teens, that this globalization, extended supply chains, it was revealed during the pandemic about the vulnerability, what that means to have these extended supply chains. And I think also that there's an effort, I think countries realize that we want to be more self-dependent, self-reliant on for some products. It's been a long goal for many countries to be, especially rich countries, to be food self-sufficient. And so that really has one of the biggest programs in the EU is CAP, the Common Agricultural Programs, which is subsidy for farmers. But I think that from the other side, given the rise of national security issues, I think that you've seen countries, including the United States, Europe, Japan, India, want to produce their own semiconductor chips, want to be able to produce their own medical supplies like face masks and other devices. And so I think that there's seeking a better balance, seeing that globalization went far, and now we're trying to find out like a new equilibrium. But I'm sort of suspicious about how much de-globalization is really taking place. For example, so the US puts tariffs on Chinese goods. So what do Chinese companies do? The same thing that US companies do and move production outside of China. Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Mexico. And so this just changes sort of which country we're trading with. It doesn't really change the overall US deficit. And the imbalance with the world remain the same. So some of the deficit the US used to have with China now can be found in Vietnam. And so I'm a little suspicious about the extent of the globalization or de-globalization. And I think it's still growing, but perhaps growing slowly and just changing the configuration of it.
Well, Mark, another point with the tariffs was to try to stimulate manufacturing to come home, to bring onshoring back to the U.S. or friendshoring. I don't know how much friendshoring with Mexico we can do if we're slapping 25% tariffs on it, but the idea was to get off the dependence of China and have multinational companies look at building domestically versus abroad or manufacturing domestically versus abroad. Do you think that plays into the rationale here with some of these tariffs?
Oh yes, I think this is exactly what's going on. I would phrase it a little bit differently. I'd say that the neoliberals, given the security risks, that for the neoliberals, friendshoring or nearshoring was good enough. But I think for Trump's administration, he says it's not good enough. It's got to be onshoring, and I think that's ultimately what the tariffs are about: producing more goods here, and partly because Trump, I think, has this pre-modern, pre-Adam Smith, pre-David Ricardo type of view on trade, where he thinks a trade deficit is somebody else taking advantage of us. And it doesn't really work that way. And I think it's a very simple notion, comparative advantage, trade. And I think that Trump has this mercantilist attitude that the only thing that's trade surplus is good, trade deficit is bad, even though the U.S. has been running a chronic trade deficit since the early 1960s. And yet, when you look at the wealth in the United States, it's never been greater. I think that's the thing that people have a hard time reconciling. Big trade deficit, but the household net worth has never been higher.
That's so important to understand. Plus, tying this into markets is that, look, the US markets are dominant markets around the world when you consider their valuations compared to everything else. But you also need to understand that the companies in the US are global companies. They take advantage of these, I guess, trade imbalances and offshoring some of their products. So, Mark, in terms of your portfolio, the way you see this playing out in markets, are trade wars, are tariffs actually going to hurt US markets because of the fact that so many of the largest US companies, the dominant US companies, are utilizing the world for their benefit and also for shareholders' benefit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would put it like something like this, that Trump's tariffs are not simply aimed at foreign countries, Canada, Mexico, Europe, China. I think that the ultimate target of the tariffs are U.S. companies' expansion strategy. It's not that Mexican auto companies are exporting a lot of cars to the United States. No, it's General Motors and Ford and European producers who produce cars in Mexico and export them to the United States. And so I think Trump wants to change and he talks about this. We talked about how his domestic enemies are worse than his foreign enemies. And I think that the American corporate elite, who don't really welcome Trump for the most part, I think are really the targets of the tariffs. They're the ones who are going to have to change their behaviors. And so, yeah, I think that's his real goal is to change the expansion strategy of U.S. companies. No more putting jobs out of the United States. And I think that the challenge, though, is that as some of that manufacturing capacity comes back to the U.S., I think what we're going to find is that it doesn't really produce a lot of jobs, partly because manufacturing is subject to automation. And that's what we're seeing. New factories don't have a lot of people working in them. Take a look at a modern auto factory. Be amazed at the number of robots. And in any event, you just think about what's happened to manufacturing jobs. In the fourth quarter of last year, we lost 58,000 manufacturing jobs in the U.S. In the third quarter, we lost roughly 40,000 manufacturing jobs. It's almost every quarter the U.S. has lost manufacturing jobs for the last several years. And so the problem is we can bring back manufacturing capacity, but to make it competitive means that we're not going to have a lot of real live labor working at them. It'll be automated and increasingly so.
Yeah, what an interesting nuance that is as well. Boy, oh boy, I feel like we are going to be talking tariffs till we're blue in the face and until Trump is out of office, which means potentially 4 years from now. We'll see just how much longer the tariffs against Canada and Mexico are pushed back. We'll see what other countries get tied up in this trade war, and we'll also see just how the world continues to get fractured by the US really trying to take a strong arm approach to everybody else. Who knows how this is going to play out, but this is the main driver in markets and in a lot of conversations I think we all have. Marc, great having you on this show again. Marc Chandler, managing partner at Bannockburn Global ForEx, also editor of the Mark II Market website, which you can click the link to in the show notes. Marc, thanks for joining us on Super Bowl Sunday. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Corey. Good luck to everybody. And remember, those reciprocal tariff announcements more forthcoming next week.